Welcome to the King's Corner. That's not very kingly behavior. I just want to put that out there. This is the King's Corner, where we look upon only the most kingly of reads, and we decide if they join the banquet that is second breakfast, or we toss it into the fiery inferno of the Mount of Doom. Today's book is a regal choice, offered by the matriarch of my birth. A classical favorite among her cinematic collection, though diversified only in that she enjoys the cinematic depiction of the events rather than the literary word. And that shall be The Dead Zone. Published on August 30th of 1979, The Dead Zone is Stephen King's 8th published work to grace the shelves to haunt readers everywhere. It was nominated for a flurry of awards, but so far as I can tell, it didn't win any. Though it did receive 2 adaptations worth talking about. The first was a movie adaptation starring Christopher Walken as Johnny Smith and Martin Sheen as Greg Stilson, and was released on October 21st of 1983. This is the version that my mom most often watches. The second was a TV series adaptation that was released in the late 2002, which took far more liberties with its source material than the movie actually did. Ironically, both also changed what the titular Dead Zone actually is. But that's not really a conversation for this review. This is about the book solely. If you guys want to see me do adaptation reviews, make sure to let me know. But another interesting bit of trivia behind the book is that The Dead Zone was labeled by the American Library Association as the 82nd most banned and challenged book in the United States during the 1990s. That is, 1990 to 1999. All very interesting facts. But for the time being, here's the report card. And from here we move on to, well, not quite the cover review, but the cover review. You see, like with Firestarter before, this book is old. We're talking it's gonna be 45 years old next year. In addition to it being one of the works of Stephen King, it has gotten quite a bit of fame, and therefore the book has received many covers over its long lifespan. So reviewing the cover is going to be a bit more difficult. The one I have is okay. It definitely sets up a decent tone for the story, while also referencing an earlier part of the book which showcases Johnny Smith's power, before he even really gets into his coma. Another notable thing here is I could definitely see it drawing someone in, though I might argue that it gives somewhat of a false premise with its imagery. As looking at it, you might think it's more into, the game of chance and gambling aspects of what happens than it actually ends up doing. But digging through the covers that have graced this book, it's actually a bit shocking how often the cover seems to have very little to do with its source material. It seems like the cover makers are just throwing random spooky imagery at the wall and doing their best to see what sticks. A couple here and there use scenes from the book, but they are very often minor scenes that don't actually speak to what the book's about. Like this edition from Les Lèvres du Pouchet, I think that's how I say it, where it uses a sort of scene from the book where Johnny gets a vision of a steakhouse burning down, which kills a graduating party of high school seniors. It's a semi-important scene in the book later on, but it's not really indicative of what the book is about. And if you were to look at this cover with no context, impossible as that may seem, the cover itself would have you go in thinking that the house fire or the steakhouse fire is an important event. It's like the central event. Or take this cover from Beta. Beta or Beta. It's spelled Beta, but it's Czechoslovakian, so it might be Beta. I've never actually even heard Czechoslovakian spoken. Actually, I have heard Czechoslovakian spoken. I'm not familiar with it. So, and obviously with that being said, this was published in Czech, where the cover doesn't feel at all connected to the book. I mean, it feels like a discount Animorphs title, to be completely honest. I mean, just look at that. anyone who's read The Dead Zone and knows Czechoslovakian culture, can you, like, is maybe there's bits of culture I'm missing here that might tie into what's going on? Because, like, even this little, like, this cheetah thing up here, I'm obviously not going to be able to touch it because I'm imposing the image, but this cheetah thing up here and part of the cover, it doesn't even work with, like, a story that I think they're drawing from to make this, because the story that's being told that references a predator cat is a tiger. Maybe it means something more important in their culture, but it doesn't work from my context. Personally, I would ultimately say that the one I have is of the better, at least of those I found. But some of the newer covers, such as this one right here, are the ones I would probably say are the best covers of this book. But not to dawdle too long into the subject, we'll move on to the synopsis. Now, the synopsis for the context of the review is, I kind of had to guess a little bit. I kind of had to guess based on memory a little bit for my TBR. There was a synopsis just on the inside, but it's not very helpful. My binding's coming off. Just noticed that. That's a bummer. But anyways, the synopsis I kind of had to guess at because the back didn't really have it. And the one right here on the inside isn't quite a synopsis either. It gives you enough, but yeah. But anyways, for the sake of this review, this story is about a young man named Johnny Smith, who is in an accident that puts him into a coma for the better part of 4.5 years, as opposed to like the 20 I thought when I said it out loud. When he awakes, he finds that not only has his world changed immensely, his girlfriend having married another man, and the world of politics itself has so drastically shifted, but now he also has the uncanny ability to psychically read people by touching them, or things they were close to. This can be everything from learning vast amounts about them, but also seeing the future in which they're involved. This does everything from assuring a mother that her son will be able to see again after a small surgery, to telling his physical trainer that her house is about to burn down so she can call the fire department and save it, or perhaps the most daunting of which, and the one the book is most famously remembered for, a political candidate that's currently running for office that will one day become president and lead the world into a nuclear apocalypse it's not going to be able to recover from. The book is ultimately about Johnny being faced with a choice. The book is ultimately about Johnny being faced with a question. To what extent does he utilize his powers to affect the world around him when all he really wants to do is go back to being a teacher of young minds? And from there, we're just going to go ahead and jump straight into the review. Now, for the most part, I enjoyed this read immensely. It's your basic, to be fair though, it is your basic Stephen King novel, don't get me wrong. It takes place in Maine, deals with people inexplicably developing psychic powers, and pretty much has all your standard King cliches that are in these kind of books. But it's still a decent read. It's actually fairly eerie reading it nowadays in 2023, considering a fair amount of the political elements and how well they can sync up to certain candidates within the US starting around 2016, to say. But overall, the work stands pretty well the test of time, and the story, though about psychic powers, is more about the weight of responsibility and trying to adapt to the world where you constantly feel like an outsider. Honestly, the movie adaptation really played it up. Johnny's conflict with Greg Stilson really only occurs near the latter half of the book. We're talking like the last 20% latter half, not the last 50%. I will warn that with time, there are a few scenes here and there that have not aged well, and a few others that can be hard to read. Our first chapter, from Stilson's point of view, is a rather disheartening scene about animal abuse, as he basically kicks a dog to death out of petty vengeance. And there's more than a few outdated terms here and there, which, while they might have been acceptable at the time, are considered by and large more offensive now. But I'm not holding either of these against the book in a negative light. It's just a fair warning for those who read after watching this review that these scenes are going to be in here. Now, truth be told, I only have two main criticisms about this book, and one of them is definitely far more subjective than the other. That one, of course, is that the book at times can be a little bit boring. Now, The Dead Zone is no It or Under the Dome or any of the King's work that would give any reader night terrors from the mere prospect of its sheer size and length. before the horror actually even starts. But for the most part, there is no external conflict for Johnny to deal with. The story seems to be building to the Stillson versus Smith conflict as if it's going to be the main collision in the book. But that, again, that only really takes up the last 20% of the book at most. Even the Castle Rock Strangler subplot is introduced, kind of ignored for a large portion of the book, before it finally makes a turn to the story itself, and then goes back to becoming a background event. Now, when Johnny is dealing with an external threat, the book reads really good and easy. And that's not to diminish the other parts where the conflict is clearly meant to be internal. It's just harder to get through in those moments. It's basically an elongated scene from Spider-Man where Uncle Ben Peter Parker's trying to determine, should he really follow Uncle Ben's advice with the whole, with great power comes great responsibility, to put a fine point on it. Now, the second main issue I had with this book is that it jumps around a lot. And I think that's ultimately where most of my main issues with this book kind of come from. Now, you can see shades of this in the previous point, like with the Castle Rock Strangler. But to further explain, we often see chapter POVs from various characters. Everything from side characters like Johnny's father, Herb, and Sarah, to one-off characters solely for that specific chapter. And while this works to various degrees, I do also think it does make the book weaker overall if King had just stuck to maybe Johnny Smith's point of view. Now, this style does work best when it's focusing on characters like Stillson. Since Johnny only really comes into conflict with him directly in the later portions of the book, the Stillson-centric chapters do well to show us the kind of man Stillson is, and subtly hinting that Stillson, whether or not he realizes it, has psychic powers he's unwittingly using, sort of like Johnny. We can see the kind of arrogant, petulant child that Stillson really is beneath his facade, while slowly waiting for Johnny to finally come and meet him, showing all the awful things Stillson has done, or hinting at them through the actions of those affiliated with him. It also works fairly well when it comes to Johnny's father, as we can see the strain that Johnny's comatose nature is putting on him, the slow mental decline of his wife and Johnny's mother, Vera, as she throws herself at more and more cult-like mentalities, before eventually wrapping up his part of the story with the death of Vera, which serves as a warning to Johnny that he can't save everyone with his powers, but also a bit like the Uncle Ben point in this backstory.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Also, Stephen King was making fun of Scientology before it was cool, because you cannot tell me that some of the things that Vera falls into are not reminiscent of their beliefs. But then you get things like Sarah's chapter. And at first you think it's going to be important to the narrative. Showcase Sarah's trying to move on, eventually comes to terms with Johnny being gone, only to suddenly have him back, and showcase the emotional turmoil as she's pulled between the two men she loves. Her husband, who's the father of her children, and this old flame that was ripped from her before they could really explore the depths of their love for each other. But around the middle, after her and Johnny finally do break and Sarah cheats on her husband, Sarah just kind of vanishes from the book. She no longer seems important to the plot. Johnny doesn't seem particularly distraught on losing her after that, and she only really reappears in a chance mention of one of Stillson's chapters, a brief appearance at a wedding, and near the very end. And because of that, a lot of her chapters in the early portion feel pointless in hindsight. There's also the Castle Rock Strangler. You get a POV shot from him, and I think it was during his first murder, and it gives you insight on what he's doing and why he's doing it. But after that, it just sort of feels pointless. Johnny never actually even talks to the guy who it actually turns out being. We never learn anything new on him after this chapter, and it mostly seems to just serve as exposition, so King doesn't have to tell us the same information later, when Johnny finally scries the guy. So it in a way, it feels included just because King couldn't find a less clunky way to include it. Now, the reason I say some of these are unnecessary as characters even like Susan, I think King could have gotten more mileage on blanking us out after Johnny's put in the coma. So we, as well as him, can be surprised by the twists and turns he learns about and how his life has changed, and how the world has changed. So with that being said, the book is pretty good, but I do admit that it can be something of a tough read. And in the end, I'd probably only give this a 7 out of 10. So yeah, The Dead Zone is actually a decent read. I would definitely recommend it for anyone interested in King's works. But I would say that of the various works that I have read of him, it's not his best. I wouldn't put it near how much I enjoyed reading Firestarter, but I wouldn't really say it's bad. Even the 7 out of 10 is pretty loose in my opinion. It's just not quite an 8 out of 10 for me. I think if it dropped a couple things and, rewrote a couple scenes, that this would definitely be an 8 out of 10 without fault. I don't have too much to say about it. Most of my rating is just from personal enjoyment. I'm sure other people will enjoy it much more than I did. And like I said, reading it in 2023 is super eerie if you've experienced U.S. politics for the past 8 years. So, with that being said, I don't have much else to say on this. And we move on. Okay, so, funny thing about the next book. I'll explain later, but the next book isn't quite what you think it's going to be. If you watch my TVR, it's going to be a bit different next week. So, that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone. And your king demands subscribers. Actually, he demands subscribers from me, so, go and click that subscribe button before you leave. Hey, where you going? Come back here! Come back here!